Well, 35 years ago, when I started working in this field, this work was called a whole lot of other things. It was called equal opportunities for girls and women. It was called equity for students and all sorts of other things. The main differences then were, well, the similarities were we had a whole of school model. We didn't have the strength in the curriculum materials that we've got now, specifically directed to this work. We were working with teachers in schools to develop their own, particular to each school. We did have strong level of government support. We had resources located in regional offices. But what we didn't have was the alliances that we have now with all sorts of sectors. We didn't have the really strong philosophical agreement about the theoretical basis about what we were doing and why. And the strengths I see now are that we do have a lot of those things in place. We had some of the pillars there all that time ago, not all of the ones we've got now though. I think it's a great time at the moment.
It is indeed. Jess, what about you?
So I probably started working in this sector about 7 years ago, and I when I was employed, one of the roles that I had was to start the sexual assault prevention program for secondary schools in the Barwon region. And at that time, there really wasn't much around. That was seen to be kind of one of the leading programs to take on. And before I had come to Barwon Casa, a lot of work had been done to try and scope what should be done. I guess the background to that was that lots of schools were often coming to the service and had been over a number of years looking for kind of one-off, more response type stuff, and what had been decided at that time was that that wasn't the best way to go and that we needed to have a better response to that. But there might have been one or two other programs at the time, but there really wasn't a lot around. So
I've come a little bit later to Respect for Relationships in the piece. My last role was at the Department of Primary Cabinet, which at that time had the Women in Prevention portfolios when the Royal Commission was set up. And during the life of the Royal Commission, and I was there a bit after before I moved to education. So certainly, a lot of deep history before I came to it. But one of the great privileges of working and interacting so closely with the Royal Commission is I was able to see a lot of the evidence, hear from so many of the witnesses, and through that process hear the history of respect for relationships, of prevention and of family violence more broadly. So that was a fantastic, if you're going to get across the subject, a Royal Commission is a really good way to do it. And working in the Women of Prevention portfolios at that time, the Our Watch pilot was up and running. And there was a decision made at that time by government to put respect for relationships in the curriculum. So a hell of a lot was happening at that time, and it was fantastic to sort of deep dive into that, and also see how prevention, how respect for relationships was just so incredibly critical to the government's broader family violence reform agenda in partnership with the prevention sector and the response sector. So that's certainly something that the conversation in government has been. We know that there needs to be radical changes in service response. We know a lot of that's expensive. We know that's a lot of where the money goes. We know that goes to a lot of big systems, but prevention is the way that we're going to make sure that that this doesn't happen in the long term.
Well, due to my age, I suppose, my beginning with education in this area goes back 39 years when I began work as a 21-year-old teacher in a secondary school with a very challenged community with high rates of violence, very high rates of unplanned teen pregnancies, and a very young teaching force going, how do we help these kids? So it was a grand act of improvisation, because back then there weren't the models, there wasn't the research, there wasn't the evidence base that we have now. However, it's when I began crafting the work that's been my whole life journey. But working in an education context as I have, it's also, gender wasn't at the forefront. So back then, as Pam has said, it might have been sexuality education or it was bullying, anti-bullying education, but not disaggregated to a focus on gender-based violence prevention. Or it was life skills, but now we have a science of social emotional learning. But the other thing about working in the education sector is when gender was on the agenda, it wasn't next to violence. It was the 1980s when we had that great interest in catch-up by getting girls into science and maths education, which was largely successful, not entirely, we're still working on that. Then we had the big wave in the 1990s where the gender focus in schools was what's happening to boys. It was when literacy rates for boys began to plummet, and we started to blame female teachers for that, rather than the alternative data that says boys have stopped reading for pleasure, which remains true and unresolved. So then it's in this later wave around an education focus on gender has become the connection of gender with violence. So for me, this is quite a recent arrival in my career in the Australian setting, because I've been very aware for the last more than a decade, certainly closer to 15 years, I've been working in the region, in the Asia Pacific region, or on the global scale with United Nations agencies who have been driving the focus on gender-based violence prevention way ahead of where most countries have had a country pickup rate. And I had more opportunities to pilot approaches to gender-based violence prevention in countries as different as Bangladesh and Philippines before getting the opportunity through government initiatives to actually do it back home here. So what I see very much is we're part of a global agenda, but gender keeps slipping and sliding into how it gets on the agenda in education. And we have to be very mindful about how we secure the focus that it has now, which is very different from the one it had in the past.